Good afternoon, and welcome to the November 26th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to recognize that we're on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Our clerk today is Ms. Sheila Gurry. Today's Governance and Priorities Committee meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter and Council Procedure Bylaw 2018, number 7272. As the province is now in phase 3 of the reopening plan, question period has been reinstated for those in attendance for agenda items only. The question period sign-up sheet is on the table by the double doors to my left. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write it down with your name and the agenda item on the sheet. At the start of question period, I will call those who have signed up to the podium to address council. The first item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. Ms. Gurry, I don't believe we have any.
That's correct, Chair. No late items.
Thank you. So I would be looking for a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Mayor Krogh, seconded by Councillor Martman. All those in favor? That passes. Thank you. Motion for the adoption of the minutes is circulated. Moved by Councillor Thorpe, seconded by Councillor Bonner. All those in favor? Okay. On to agenda planning. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Chair. So starting on page 11 of your original agenda is the upcoming topics for the Governance and Priorities Committee agenda planning process. And we have one meeting left in the year, which has a list that's quite ambitious. But for certain, I can tell you that staff have discussed that the neighborhood associations Part 3 will be coming forward on that date. There could be a reimagine portion again on that date. If not, there could be some possible emergency management topic that might be coming to that date as well. So if you have any questions, the remainder of the items that are noted for the 13th, I'll just say before questions, will be moved into January and or February when budget is over and the new year has begun. So any questions that you might have on the agenda topics and or the format for those meetings, now would be a good time.
I'm not seeing anything from council. Thank you. On to community wellness and livability, the commercial street master plan. Mr. Lindsay.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair, Council. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. As you mentioned, the first item on your agenda is the commercial street master plan. As you will recall, Council earlier this year gave direction and support to proceed with what at the time we had called the revitalization plan or a master urban design plan. So we've proceeded since that time with RFP and now have our consultants on board and they're here with us this afternoon and they're going to run you through the work that they're planning to undertake. As with many of the projects that we do these days, this is a cross-department plan. So although I'm introducing it, it could easily be Mr. Sims or Mr. Harding if they were here, because it's really all departments that have a role and a responsibility in the downtown. So it's those parties are all working together. The reality is when you have all departments, you need somebody who herds the cats, so to speak, and that task falls to Mr. James Knight, who's our project coordinator here at the city. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Knight and ask him to introduce our consultants. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. Good afternoon, Council. Good afternoon, Chairperson. As Dale mentioned, my name is James Knight, and I am the project manager for the city for the Commercial Street Master Plan. And you're all aware of the project, I know this, and the project is about developing an action plan which is going to refresh the public space on Commercial Street and surrounding streets. And we're going to incorporate the needs of local businesses and try to enhance opportunities for community events. The process is relying fairly heavily on a consultation process with key stakeholders as well as the public. And this process has just begun, and starting tomorrow and Wednesday as well, we're having open houses right here at the Vancouver Island Conference Centre downstairs from 1 to 6 in the Dodds Narrows room. And as Dale mentioned, our consultants from Tool Design are here to help us out with the process. And I'm going to introduce Tyler Gawley to you, and he's going to go through exactly what the plan is for accomplishing this. Tyler?
Thank you. Hello, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've just asked a couple colleagues of mine to come up with me. This is Ryan Martinson, based out of Calgary, and Ian Lockwood of Florida as well as Ontario. His parents retired out here. Actually, they're no longer with us, but he has a long history and understanding of the community, and it's a big privilege for us to be here and work in places where we have loved ones and friends to work. So thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, guys. I don't know exactly how to get this up.
We'll be able to get that up for you.
Wonderful, thank you. It's pretty short, but just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing this week. Does this slide?
Just over to the,
Okay, there we go. Just didn't push it hard enough. So as you all know, the Commercial Street project has been in front of you before. It runs from Dallas Square Park, kind of in the north, all the way down to the confluence or the connection of Wallace Street, Albert Street, and near the hub area, the hub project. We know going in that there's been a lot of really great work done by administration and various others on integrated projects that align with this. Terminal Avenue, the Hub project, and the work that Dr. David Whitty has been doing for Diana Krall Plaza. And so our work will certainly be integrated with those efforts, and we'll be meeting with those teams during the week. The scope, as sort of introduced to you all, is to develop a unified design vision for the study area, looking at the finishes and the treatments. And it's to help to produce a phasing plan to inform the capital planning process and the construction schedules for the project area. What's been made clear to us is it's not just another planning exercise, but we really want to be focused on design to move this forward and align it with the Reimagine Nanaimo efforts. Another piece of it is also to help establish urban realm design guidelines for the downtown that will go from building edge to building edge and help to inform that process for future projects in the downtown area. Our schedule, it's a really dark maroony red color. That's kind of the technical tasks. The pieces in kind of a tealy blue are when we'll be engaging with folks. So right now we're in the third row down, the public consultation for discovery. And as James mentioned, our process is heavily laden and requires engagement with the community and with the business community and yourselves as well. And so we're doing that now to really learn more about the street and how people use it, what their needs are, some of the issues, so that we can really have an informed design process going forward. So it's really around discovery. There will be a subsequent process, another charrette week-long workshop scheduled for February, where we'll be bringing some additional options and really designing at that point in time. So that's looking out to February. And the point in April is when we're going to be having a further engagement, looking at the preferred design options and getting final feedback on that design. And for the week, it's a very busy little chart here, snipped out of Excel, but we have a series of stakeholder meetings that we're going to be having throughout the week. A few today, predominantly with city staff, meetings on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then this is slightly erroneous. The design studio open to drop-in that's noted on November 24th in the morning before lunch. There won't be a drop-in then. We're just loaded up with stakeholder interviews. But in the afternoons of Tuesday and Wednesday, there will be opportunities for the public or for anyone to be dropping into the studio space down in the convention center here to provide input to our team, and we'll be documenting that. And that's the end of my short presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gawley. Any questions from council? Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair, and through to our delegation. On your first screen where you show the area that you're going to be looking at, it doesn't include the area recently purchased by the city where the Acme building used to be, Gene Burns building used to be, and the area up there. Were you asked to look at that, or is that going to be part of it in the future? And this is an old slide, or?
I'll maybe let Bill answer that one.
Sure. Thanks, Chair. That's a good question. You know, as Mr. Gully mentioned, this is going to be an integrated project. So we've got two project teams working on both of these. The intent of this is to establish the design guidelines for the downtown core, and that'll be incorporated into the development of the hub project as well. We've got, you know, urban designers. Frank D'Ambrosio has been brought into the hub project as well. And so there's going to be an integration. As the work moves forward, these two projects will align. We certainly want that coherent vision right from Tideline Park all the way to Dallas Square.
Yep.
One more, if I may, and this is to our consultants. We're not in a position yet in society where it's taken as a given. So there's no really mention of the work that would include Indigenous themes into the design, possibly Indigenous spaces that were more culturally appropriate. So in the work that you're going to do, are you going to be including that, and not only for Indigenous, but also for various other organizations or people, people with disabilities, that sort of thing, to bring it all together? We're going to be looking to see that when it's available?
Councillor Bonner, yes. We're applying what's referred to as a gender-based analysis plus model to our work. It extends far beyond gender. That's what the plus stands for, but it's a way to incorporate diversity and inclusion into the design process and the design decisions, yes. So Indigenous, First Nations engagement and ideas and themes, ensuring people with disabilities can navigate the space, making sure it's a safe and comfortable space for all residents is certainly going to be top of mind. And frankly, that's why we need a lot of people to participate in the design process and the engagement, so we can understand from their perspectives what they need to have that space be successful and comfortable for them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bonner. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, my question was basically the same as Councillor Bonner's first question. When Council had earlier discussions about the hub project, I think my comment at that time was that I felt it needed to be considered in conjunction with an overall vision for downtown Nanaimo. So I'm really pleased to hear you use the word integration, as Mr. Sims did, because I think it does need to be included in your study, certainly at least on the edge of it, because it's such an important piece of our downtown. So I appreciate that and look forward to your ongoing work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong.
Two questions, thank you, Chair. The first one was on the survey that's gone out, you can get the results where it will show you 3 of the things, but it doesn't show what people like and what people don't like. Is there a reason for that?
In terms of how it shows up on the website?
Well, when you go into the survey, you do the survey, and then you can go see what the results of the survey are, but it only gives you the results of 3 of the questions, not the questions where it says, what do you like about Commercial Street, what don't you like? It doesn't give you those 2 answers. Is there a specific reason why it doesn't?
Councillor Armstrong, I don't have a great answer for you. It's just I believe that the statistical results of the first 3 questions were able to be shown up. The other ones were comment-based.
That's correct. The first 3 where you pick which you want, and then the others. And my other point on that survey is you can do it 100 times without ever being caught on that. Is there a way to rectify that?
That's a good question. That's really part of the interaction that our communications department is taking up. I might ask Ms. Gurry if she's got any knowledge on that particular subject.
I don't have the knowledge off the top of my head, but I could look into that for certain.
Yeah, that would be important for me because I know somebody that's done it 20 times, so. And it wasn't me. And then the other question that was sent to me by a couple residents is that we've spent millions of dollars throughout the years trying to fix Commercial Street. Are you going to look at why those remedies didn't fix or didn't work?
Yeah, our process one answer to your previous question is the key process for this week and including the public meeting tomorrow is to ask those types of questions to dig in more deeply with people that are attending those meetings about what they like and what they don't like and the issues that are present. So we'll be capturing that in another way in addition to the survey. And your question now about the past studies, that's certainly part of our process is to look at past work. Because we want to learn from that. We also want to make sure that we're valuing and honoring people's contributions to that past work. We know a lot of effort and time and the public coming in, for instance, to participate in those. We want to make sure we're building on that instead of having to start from scratch. So that is certainly part of our process.
Thank you very much.
I think that's it for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Look forward to meeting with you this week.
Next up, we have information briefing on stormwater utilities. Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. I'll pass this over fairly quickly to Mr. Rosen, who will be introducing it and introducing our consultant. Unfortunately, our consultant, Mr. Lee from Urban Systems, was intending to be here, but coming from Victoria was maybe a little dicey. Maybe there's some irony in this or not, I don't know. But really the intent today is to introduce the topic of a stormwater utility to council. This is, as Councillor Thorpe said, this is a user pay, an example of equity in funding our stormwater utility. As council is well aware, storm drainage infrastructure, anything to do with natural water courses is funded directly from general taxation. So having its own separate utility, similar to sewer or water, is an attractive funding to set some clarity and some predictability around funding. So I'll just pass it over to Mr. Rosen. Again, this is intended to introduce, and we're pretty excited about it.
Thank you.
Production. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think the mic's on now. So the total value of the city's drainage infrastructure is probably somewhere between $700 million and $1 billion in asset value. It's the city's second most valuable asset class behind water. So the water supply dams and all that infrastructure. So it's the second most valuable asset behind that. Obviously, some of that infrastructure is new and some of it's getting old. And as with all assets, there comes a time where we need to think about renewal of those assets. So what is the problem right now with the stormwater infrastructure or the funding model that we have? Currently, funding for drainage is drawn from general taxation mostly. That means it needs to compete with many other city projects and programs. So you can imagine we have maybe a culvert replacement that's competing with something else, like maybe aquatics or parks. It's much more fun. So it can be challenging to fund the drainage infrastructure. Another issue, another sort of part of the problem to solve is an issue around fairness, as Mr. Sims alluded to. The more intense users of the stormwater systems, those users or properties that have a lot of what we call impervious area, so a lot of paved area or like a solid roof or something like that, they tend to create a lot more demand on the stormwater system than a parcel that has a lot of sort of green space or what have you. And that doesn't align with how much that particular property pays in taxes. So there's a misalignment there between the use of the system and how it's being paid for. It's a little bit of a fairness equity piece there. We also have an issue around, as council knows, we often package projects. We call them concurrent projects. That's where we have like a water project on a street, and we'll look at the sewer and the drainage infrastructure and the condition of the pavement and the sidewalk and the streetlights and pretty much everything. We package up a package of scope that makes a lot of sense. Quite often what will happen with the drainage infrastructure is we would like to include it in the package, but funding is so challenged with it that we end up sometimes not including it or delaying the whole package of projects so we can wait and sort of afford the drainage piece. So it creates quite a less than ideal scenario in terms of project timing and project scope. A big one here is risk. So obviously in the past week, we've all become abundantly aware of sort of drainage risk. Historically, the drainage designs, these designs that were completed historically, they might not be up to the task going forward. So what that means is it translates into increased risk. So the risk is going up faster than the funding available to mitigate it. And I certainly saw that a couple weeks ago when I got my house insurance renewal, and it was substantially more than previously. Obviously, they understand this increasing cost of risk. So funding drainage from general taxation was probably okay when Nanaimo was a little bit more rural. You know, there's a couple of culverts, there was some ditches on the side of the road that required a little bit of maintenance. As we became more urbanized and more dense, that built form of the city, now we require storm mains, catch basins, leads. We have control structures, detention ponds, you know, urban water courses, outlets. There's a lot more going on now. So having the historic way that we collected revenue for dealing with it, it's sort of just out of date. Another sort of problem here is missed opportunities. And this kind of comes back to that discussion around concurrent projects. In this case, it's around development. There's a lot of development that goes on. They have a lot of requirements on site that meet the modern standard and so on, but they need to drain into the city's receiving system, which might not be quite up to scratch. So when I say a missed opportunity, ideally we would like to be able to partner with that developer to upgrade part of the city's system, but the lack of funding really translates into some missed opportunities. And really the last piece here is just around, there's a lot of urban water courses that we have concerns around water quality, habitat, and other environmental considerations. The funding levels really are insufficient to be able to meet the community's expectations around how the city handles that side of things. So to address this, as Mr. Sims mentioned, one way to look at it is to develop a stormwater utility that would provide a more equitable funding model as well as ideally sufficient funding to deal with these issues as the city sees fit. So to help us with that, we've brought a consultant on board, Urban Systems. They have experience implementing these types of utilities in other communities. And the person that's going to speak in a moment here is Aaron Lee. He's a professional engineer with Urban Systems, and he has experience implementing these types of utilities around the province. So I'll turn it over to Aaron. He's coming to us from Zoom.
Before you go, actually, I have a question from Councillor Armstrong, if you don't mind.
Thank you. When you're looking at some of these problems to solve, when we're looking at our new developments, are they being addressed through getting the DCCs or putting it on to the developer to do? Or is it still all falling solely onto the city's pocketbook?
Through the chair to Councillor Armstrong. So for development, there's a number of requirements that they have on site that they need to meet in terms of runoff volumes. So they have to install things like detention basins or ponds. They have runoff controls essentially that they have to deal with. And that sort of is to the modern standard, both the building code and the engineering standards and so on. But they discharge into the city's system, which takes it downstream to the ocean or to a water course or what have you. Now, if the city does have a stormwater DCC project identified, it could be part of that. We don't have a lot of those though. So generally it falls to the city's sort of regular capital works program to upgrade these types of drainage works.
So we're really fixing older subdivisions that never had anything in place at the time. Yeah, I see Mr. Sims nodding yes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome. Sorry, you were in the middle of introducing Mr. Lee.
Yeah, so I'd like to hand the presentation over to Mr. Lee, who's on Zoom, and take it away, Mr. Lee.
Thanks very much. Paul, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Council Chairperson. Appreciate you guys having us here today. Just a big thank you for being flexible today as well. We're taking the guidance here under emergency situations not to use a whole lot of fuel, although in some ways I consider that to be necessary too. It would have been nice to be there with you today. Ultimately, I think it's just a small bit of clunkiness where at the end of each slide, I'll do my best to ask staff to transition to the next slide. We can handle that okay, correct, Paul? Great, thanks. Hey, this presentation is not long, but it does cover a pretty important topic. Today, we're going to focus on the why and the how for dedicated stormwater funding. And that term stormwater utility has a lot of connections to that principle of dedicated stormwater funding. Part of this will include looking at the city's current conditions, but it also includes having a look at other utilities, more concrete examples that are already in place in BC. Next slide, please. Let's begin with some of the stormwater fundamentals. On the left-hand side, stormwater is the rainfall, runoff, and snowmelt that traverses our communities. It requires conveyance and specialized systems to properly manage it. The traditional view, going back decades, is really about getting the water in pipes and getting it off into large streams and watercourses to limit personal and property injury. And for the last 20 to 30 years, a lot of new policy throughout North America has advanced that. And now we're talking about stormwater as an integrated service, which requires comprehensive solutions, evident in part by Councillor Armstrong's question at the start around considering this from the development and new infrastructure and new works point of view. We've got many decades to realize that services related to stormwater must be integrated if they are to be effective. And the path forward across many municipalities in Canada, and especially in BC, is to find adequate and equitable, as Mr. Rosen had pointed out, equitable cost recovery, because these are fundamental to the sustainability of these systems. When we think about being able to imagine stormwater utilities, it's also important that we layer on some strategic thinking as well. And there's a number of different columns that we can think through, but on the right-hand side are just a few questions that guide us. What is that vision for stormwater management? How does the funding approach contribute to that vision? And how does forming utility relate to current or future service levels? Really, the combination of some of these technical fundamentals with how to go about planning a utility really become the core of when thinking about stormwater utilities. Overall, this is part of the driver for utilities, to package out a defined service and to give it a little bit more attention. So next slide, please. Let's look at some of those drivers. There really are two driving factors behind these utilities. One is to address local needs, and the second is to respond to those local values. Looking into them with a little bit more detail, in terms of local needs, there's that need for equitable cost recovery and stable funding. On the cost recovery side, one customer, one property owner who looks at their property, perhaps an industrial property right adjacent to a sensitive wetland, or perhaps a neighbor across the street on a more single family basis. Both of those properties contribute significantly different conditions for stormwater. The notion of equitability relates primarily to creating ties between how that property is used and the impact on the stormwater system. In terms of addressing local needs, it's important to solidify a level of service, to recognize what it is that you are going to fund and what that looks like. In many cases, stormwater systems expect there to be small levels of ponding throughout the streets. This is a normal part of how most stormwater systems work. But being able to define some of those things and creating those definitive levels of service become key for charges and for being able to connect with the public. And that notion of being able to show those clear links between land use and cost of service. When it comes to local values, what we're really saying here is that there needs to be a public or business or government benefit to doing so. We want to build programs with awareness and value for service with customers so that they have a clear understanding of why the utility exists and where the charges come from. In most cases, certainly in BC, there's far more public interest in these types of utilities than there had been before. Stronger connection towards adapting to climate change, being able to protect environmental values, and all of these are encouraging more governments to consider what a stormwater utility can do for its local values and public needs. And of course, there are abundant strategic priorities related to governance and services that matter greatly when you're thinking about a utility and the benefits that it offers. Likely, like any sort of important endeavor, you need purpose, and these drivers help. The next slide, we'll talk about those a little bit deeper. So Nanaimo's purpose for stormwater funding started many, many years ago, but in 1998, there was a bit of a milestone. That 1998 policy made it clear that stormwater services must be comprehensive. You can see within these three pillars of habitat and ecology, risk and flooding, and balanced services, that there was a lot of things to consider, a number of things to juggle, and that in particular, that funding must be in balance with other goals. Even though it's 23 years old today, and perhaps could go through a bit of a refresh, it's very important to see that the economic and social objectives about balanced services have been in place for some time. And most communities who have gone about creating a stormwater utility had similar policies in place. Ultimately, conditions such as environment, climate, and infrastructure are changing, as Mr. Rosen pointed out, and stormwater funding must adapt too. Next slide, please. Stormwater is much more than rainfall, storm grates, and pipes. And again, that policy confirmed it. Since then, a more complete picture of service delivery, the one that we need to fund, has emerged. And on the right-hand side, although it's Reimagine and IMO, which is ongoing, this is some previous OCP language, and I'm sure previous OCPs before that referenced similar, begin to point out the integrated nature well beyond getting rainfall into pipes. There's the element of resource protection in terms of nature, environment, ecology, being able to manage development and the special measures required to do so. Looking at integrated capital, another point that was raised at the very top about the problem we need to solve, and recognizing that water really doesn't know a political boundary, and working with partners and having the resources to work with partners accordingly is pretty critical. Ultimately, stormwater services and funding include policy direction from the OCP as laid out here. And each of those policies requires those specialized resources. And we found that communities with dedicated funding have been able to accomplish their policy objectives better than those that do not. On the left-hand side, we have a few examples of the real assets we are managing. And as Paul had pointed out, approaching $1 billion in overall asset value. 450,000 meters of linear assets with many other natural and other engineering facilities. Drainage infrastructure represents about 20% of the total value. There's significant renewal expected over the next 30 years, which means some of those pipes, culverts, and other facilities that have been installed are due for replacement. Natural assets themselves, they offer new benefits and services that themselves require investment too. Multiple policies and bylaws that dictate service levels and regulate accordingly. And of course, all of these conditions are dynamic, and good service delivery requires that adaptive management. Next slide, please. So those assets and policy goals must be adequately funded if we are to achieve them. Two common streams for cost recovery. In simple terms, the first is capital costs, the second is operational costs. Under capital, we're thinking of flood control, infrastructure renewal and natural assets, and special climate change projects. And for operational, we're getting into the water quality and species protection programs, drainage operations, and regular maintenance and programming. Exploring a stormwater utility, as staff is recommending, does require an analysis. This means examining current costs and projecting future costs as well. And there are generally quite a few methodologies in play that we can follow to do so. Again, the thinking here is about cost recovery. Next slide, please. It's these types of questions that really lay out the methodology in particular. And through outreach, estimations, and accounting analysis can help to answer two fundamental questions. First, how do we set it up to be effective? And second, how do we make it sustainable? So on the left-hand side, we think about our aspirations to weigh. What are the level of public interest? What are those priorities, both initial and long-term? What are our local goals for utility? And how do we leverage those partnerships to complement our services, recognizing that achieving broader watershed health and sustainability is going to require contributions from more than just government. The analysis to undertake, what are those medium-term cost projections? What about the land use impacts? And what kind of a user pay model could be set up to connect dedicated stormwater funding back to the use of the land? Are there varied or constant service levels? What about different levies? And how does the organization go about setting itself up for success? So this kind of methodology and these questions have been answered many, many times before by other utilities. And the intent is to go through something tried and tested, but to land on the more custom answers that make sense for an IMO. So these questions are key, and it's part of the lens that we take when we look at concrete examples in other communities. Next slide, please. So this is just 5 examples of stormwater utilities in BC. And we're showing these here because it's been part of the preliminary research that's been done to date, but it also gives a bit of a picture around this choice about a stormwater utility or dedicated funding, that it's not necessarily about do you have one or do you not have one. In reality, it's more about the spectrum of choices and principles that you think through when setting one up. So on the left-hand side, as Mr. Sims pointed out, the more historically common, lumped into property tax rates and general revenue. First up, though, in terms of looking at some of these other concrete examples, is Campbell River. This is a very basic structure. It's a parcel tax applied to all properties within the municipality, and it's a common same parcel tax that it's applied to all. So it's the same cost if you're a single-family residential property or that 7-acre industrial property that's located adjacent to a creek. They're all charged about the same price, about $50 a year. It generates enough to cover its expenses. So it does have a check mark in terms of cost recovery. But that parcel tax can be increased as costs rise. It's fairly easy to administer, and it does not exhibit a lot of equitability or user pay. In White Rock, moving up the spectrum, you can see that complexity, cost, and equitability kind of vary across the spectrum. We tend to get a little bit deeper. There's a little bit more equitability involved. Their approach has harmonization with zoning. Basically, that is their equation for how to connect to equitability. The more impervious or gray or hard surface or concrete it is, the more likely it is to create higher levels of runoff. As a result, those properties with the more dense type zoning and more concrete type zoning end up paying a little bit more. This is how we start to move towards the equitability side of things. Like Campbell River, it is adequate to cover its costs with capital and operational. In Surrey, it's pre-selected property type classes. So it's similar to White Rock, but instead of being synchronized purely with zoning, it's actually synchronized closer towards different types of administrative tax rates. So what they tried to do was turn up the dial on administration simplicity. And this one is fairly easy to follow. It does have some roots in equitability because most of the property tax classes do have a line of sight or evidence between being a fairly green property or a fairly urban property. And again, they're trying to draw that connection between the amount of water generated during a rainfall event, which creates a load on that stormwater system, and those that tend to have less. So there's really only two different charges in Surrey, but the tax administration side of things is quite straightforward. Overall, within Surrey and White Rock, they're really moving dial towards equitability, different than Campbell River, by again, trying to draw that connection between land use and an overall charge and impact on stormwater services. And in Victoria, if this spectrum was to scale, it would probably be a little bit further off to the right. There's a number of moving parts with this one. First off, they've gone about mapping and analyzing every single property inside the city to get an estimate for the amount of impervious and pervious surface, the amount of surface that is green, the amount of surface that is concrete. They've also got an introduction of something that relates to frontage tax, and it relates to the actual type of property and whether or not it fronts an arterial or collector or highway type road. And the higher the zoning, the more dense the zoning, and the connection to some of those busier traffic has an impact on the overall charge because it relates to a street sweeping premium. Similarly, the last stack that comes on top of the charges for Victoria relates to whether or not the property has been designated in the past as a special property as a code of practice. And these codes basically refer to properties that are known to have water quality concerns. It could be things like auto mechanic shops or outdoor areas for use like painting or machining. So those types of properties that are known to have a higher risk for water quality can also have a specialized premium on top of them. So a single family residential home in Victoria pays a much smaller amount compared all the way up to a more user pay approach, depending on the type of property and its impacts on the services there. So it works a little bit like stacking. Ultimately, regardless of the principles that are applied in the design, these examples show that two primary takeaways. First up, it's stormwater utilities in BC. They generally work well. They're already in place, and many of them have been in place for a decade or more. And second, that we need to have a handle on funding principles while we do the analysis. Next slide, please. And these 5 strategic considerations or principles tend to be the ones that affect the design the most. And these are some of the principles that you would look at through a study related to stormwater funding. The first is that ease of administration. And we talked about some of those with respect to Campbell River and Surrey and White Rock. And it's really trying to make sure that the ability to go for equitable cost recovery doesn't create a complex environment internally. The degree of understanding is the second principle, and that relates to whether or not your customers have a strong understanding and the types of behaviors that are expected to turn the dial and manage their own charges. 3 is conservation and restoration, which is making sure that the cost recovery and the types of charges can demonstrate and show evidence that water quality and ecological habitat are improving. 4th is about equitability, which we've discussed quite a bit today. And the last one is revenue sustainability, which is being able to consider all of these things and ensure that the costs of providing the service can be adequately met. Ultimately, these 5 principles become the core designing elements for any sort of dedicated stormwater funding approach. Next slide, please. And lastly, in some consultation here with staff, and perhaps, Ms. Rosen, I'll just do a quick summary. If there's any close that you'd like to provide, I'll leave it to you then. But over the course of the next 15 to 18 months, the roadmap sort of looks like this: to allocate funds for additional research, which is part of the engagement today, and connecting with council with the hope of securing some funds in budget 2022 to dive into some of these policies, lessons learned, best practices, and really begin to think about designing what that utility looks like. Later in spring is to conduct some engagement, evaluate some of those principles that we looked at, and do the estimations, the accounting, and the analysis around the needs and the wants. Later, in summer or fall next year, is to conduct that assessment evaluation and narrow down some of the choices of the types of stormwater funding models that are out there, and begin to look at which ones perform best given the current situation in NIMO and preferences that are there. And fourth is to report back to interim findings to council in fall next year to look at some engagement and try to land on some direction so that in the following year, 2023, staff can prepare a business case with recommendations on how to proceed, which enables that moment of decision making to proceed, and how so, with the type of stormwater utility to suit city conditions. In summary, what we just wanted to mention here was the why and the how for stormwater utility funding is critical. And some of those problems right off the top that Mr. Rosen was speaking to ends up becoming the problems that you need to solve. Other governments in BC have been able to address a lot of these by looking at stormwater funding, and many of them have been able to introduce stormwater utilities and have been able to better fund on a more equitable basis their operations. Paul?
Mr. Lee. Thank you, Mr. Lee. So we've provided council with some information on what a stormwater utility is, a little bit of rationale for why we're considering it, and a bit of a roadmap for how we're going to move it forward. So Mr. Lee and myself, we'd be happy to take council's questions if there are any.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen, and thank you, Chair, through you to Mr. Rosen and Mr. Lee. Thank you very much for the presentation. I find this very interesting. And I think personally there's a number of areas in our city that I would like to see us investigate a move towards more user pay model. So I'll be very interested in your research and findings. My question is this, and I'm trying to simplify this, maybe overly so. When we talk about user pay, it's relatively easy to monitor the water that comes into a property. We can meter that and we can charge accordingly. We can't do the same, I don't believe, for monitoring runoff from a property or wastewater. So when I looked at your case studies and the models that they use, it seems to me that generally the differences are based on land use or zoning rather than individual properties. And to me, that would tend to automatically put more onus or tax load or assessment load onto commercial or industrial properties. So is that too simple? Is that fair to say, or is that sort of basically where this might head?
Through the chair to Councillor Thorpe, certainly the users of the system tend to be those that have a lot of impervious area, and that does translate quite often to commercial and industrial or institutional type of land uses. What can be a little bit different than what you might expect is some of those types of facilities, especially the newer ones, they have a lot of on-site controls to reduce runoff. So even though it may look like they have a large parking lot, they might have a large tank underneath it to mitigate that. So if we were to apply the exact same principles across like commercial and industrial and just treat them all the same, it wouldn't quite be as equitable as we may want to. So that's one side of the equation. For residential, there's a limited amount of residences that have big tanks that control runoff and so on. So we could probably treat residential as a land use class, but then maybe get into a little bit more detail with commercial and industrial and institutional, like Victoria did, to understand more how the impact is from each particular property. Mr. Lee, if you have anything you want to add to my answer there?
Very good answer, Mr. Rosen. Maybe just one quick note that in some cases, when you do find, as you're describing, that a commercial or industrial more intense property has gone out of its way to reduce its quantity, its load for stormwater and or improve stormwater quality. There are different modifiers or different factors that you can apply to the base charge, almost like a discount or a rebate in some respects, to be able to demonstrate that what's happening on site is not quite like it would be elsewhere. So there's a number of different tools, and that would be part of the design and research analysis, is to look at how the equitability pans out, and then to think about some of the behaviors that you're looking to see and investments you're looking to see on private property and ways to incentivize those.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting information. Thank you.
Mayor Krogh.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just as a general proposition, we've got Campbell River on one extreme, so to speak, a straightforward parcel tax, which just, with great respect, looks kind of silly. No disrespect to Campbell River, and they might have been a pioneer in charging for this, and they just haven't improved it since. What's any idea with the municipalities in British Columbia? Is Victoria, how shall I say, the premier modern trendsetter? Are there 10 municipalities doing the same thing? Are there 50? Are there 3? Any idea who's doing what in terms of an overall picture?
Through the chair, to your worship, City of Victoria is considered sort of one end of the spectrum, as Mr. Lee pointed out. They're at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of analyzing every specific property for their runoff factors. There's an incredible amount of effort and staff time that goes into evaluating that and managing that system. The flip side is it's probably the most equitable. The other end of the spectrum is, like you mentioned, it's the very simple parcel tax that doesn't look into what the contribution is for any given parcel. I think what we're envisioning or what we're hoping for is something that lands a little closer to Victoria, but we're not intending to go all the way that Victoria did. And as far as I know, there's no other community in BC that's gone that far. We would probably target something similar to Victoria for like ICI, like institutional, commercial, industrial properties, and then deal with all the residential properties as a land use class or something. Because we literally have a few thousand ICI type properties, and that would really reduce the amount of effort that would go into manage the utility billing and administration.
And if I may, is it fair to say the largest portion of British Columbia municipalities are just basically general taxation, they know it costs money and that's it? Or are they in the parcel tax category? Do they fall into the something in between parcel tax and Victoria? I just want to get a general picture of the province.
Mr. Lee, do you want to field that one?
Happy to. Through the chair, the majority of stormwater utilities in BC would sit somewhere in the middle, close to White Rock, close to Surrey, in terms of the level of understanding, administration, and otherwise. And most of them do this by a parcel tax approach. Some of them have a frontage tax that sort of goes along with it, but most of them would be by a parcel tax approach.
One of the reasons I raise this is, I mean, in consideration, Victoria's may be the most equitable, but it strikes me that that would be something else you'd have to tack on to the cost. And every time there's a redevelopment, of course, you'd be looking for, no disrespect to experts and engineers and everybody else, but somebody who's going to have to get paid to provide the new figures for the runoff that will be caused by the new development, et cetera, and thereby adding to the cost of housing. I'm not saying I'm opposed to that, but I think we have to consider also in the background that we have added layers of complexity to construction for very legitimate reasons, but I think that is a consideration. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Bonner.
I think Mr. Rudolph had his hand up and he takes precedence over.
I just had some experience because I went through the implementation of one of these Pitt Meadows about 10 or so years ago. And there was a lot of engineering that went in my experience. I'll just give you the quick story. A lot of engineering went into the front end of this to understand what the systems were, where the bottlenecks were, where the priorities were, how much it was going to cost, and a fiscal plan to get forward. The challenge became the discussion in the community about equity and payment. And that's where the rub came there, and it took a lot of heavy lifting to actually find a funding formula that the majority of people could live with, because there were stakeholder groups that had strong opinions, the farming community, and then there was the residential that didn't see. So there were some strong opinions. So no matter what solution you end up coming to as a council in the future, there'll be probably a fair amount of conversation about the issue of equity. And it was at some point in time a decision will have to be made. The other thing I'd say is you don't want to create a system that's so difficult to administer that it becomes a monster in a way. And so there will be a desire, I think, at some point in time to err on the side of simplicity and just bite the bullet. So they did it, it worked, and it solved the funding problem for a long time for them, at least. In fact, the short term, they actually had to go in debt to fund this thing to get it going. But it was, I just recall the challenges of the different definitions of equity and people's opinion on that. So, that can be expected here as well, no matter what is chosen.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions. At first brush, this looked to me like, and I'd like to phrase right off, I understand the concept here, and I've looked at Victoria's model quite a lot in the past, and I think we actually talked a little bit about it at GPC at the very beginning. And so I understand why the need is here. But at first brush, this looks like we've found something that has already been paid for through taxpayers for X amount of hundreds of years. And we're giving it a different name, and then we're going to tax it. Because that's all this works. Even if we do go with the user rate, it's going to be a tax. So that's kind of what it looks like. And I can see Mr. Rudolph saying that when the equity came up, because I can tell you right now, my property does, as far as I know, puts no water into the sewer system. I mean, into the stormwater system, because I don't have any paved driveways. And even the sidewalk's higher than my house, so everything drains in the house. And it doesn't go in the house, it goes somewhere else in the ground. So with that said, though, why is this not being managed out of asset management reserve funds? And like, how have we been paying for this? I understand you say we've been paying for general revenues, which is the asset management reserve fund. So basically we're saying we want to stop doing that and we want to charge extra, because I'm guessing the money that we had earmarked for this, we're not going to pull out of asset management reserve and put it into a new fund. We're going to start this as a new fund, funded by whatever process we come up with.
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, that'll be a future question for council, actually. Like City of Victoria, my understanding is when they implemented their stormwater utility, they made sure that it was cost neutral for people. So their taxes would go down, but the stormwater utility piece would show up, and the amount, at least for the first year or a little while, they were exactly the same. So they just separated it out and made it a bit more equitable. So City of Nanaimo Council could do the same thing, or we could say we're going to add to, leave the property taxes alone and create this stormwater utility. So that'll be a future question for council, maybe in like a year or something.
Well, I can think the first idea there would be more palatable for taxpayers if nothing changes. Then we're just saying we're just putting in a different fund. I get that. Can you show me some examples of opportunities that were missed due to not having this dedicated funding? Like you kind of said a general thing of, but is there any specific projects that we've not been able to do this type of stormwater work?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, so we don't track those missed opportunities, but I'm just thinking back to a number of situations where there's been some developments of some lots into residential and they discharge into a ditch, for example, whereas in the reality is the future, the road would have a stormwater system and so on that would be lower. So what it means is because the ditches tend to be quite shallow, the private side really doesn't have a lot of depth to work with when they have to design their pipes and their detention systems and so on. Now, if we had an opportunity, that would be a missed opportunity in that we would ideally like to install maybe part of the city stormwater system to allow that private developer to be a little deeper than they would otherwise be. And that may allow them to have a little bit deeper basement or what have you. So we don't track these, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And what's come up into our radar recently is the intake and infiltration issues that we have with their septic. I think that's the word, I&I. And will this funding be used to mitigate that works, especially in the older parts of Nanaimo?
The inflow and infiltration is a problem within the sanitary sewer. So that's where we have rainfall essentially getting into the ground and seeping into the sanitary sewer. So this fund is really about funding the stormwater infrastructure. It's a separate system. So if you don't have a stormwater system, sometimes there's more opportunity for that water to get into the sanitary sewer. So from that standpoint, they're a little bit related, but I don't think we'd envisioned funding the I&I issues with this fund.
Okay, appreciate that. So one of the discussions from consultant was regarding the quality of the runoff, and gas stations and or automobile, that sort of thing, right? We don't, as far as I know, we don't treat stormwater. It goes into the pipe and it goes out into the chuck. So how would we look at that type of water? Are we going to charge more for it, even though we're not actually doing anything to fix it?
What Mr. Lee referred to is in the capital region, they have, I can't remember what he called it, but it's a system where they track like certain types of land uses, like mechanics and gas stations and car washes, and they have a program where they are required to have like an oil water separator, and those require maintenance. Not only they have to exist, but they have to be maintained, otherwise they won't be functional. So they have a program where a business is required to document proof that they've been maintaining their system, and that ties into the whole stormwater quality piece. And as far as I know, and Mr. Lee can comment on this in a moment, is that they use some of the funding to ensure the maintenance of these oil water separators and those types of things that are part of that program. Mr. Lee, do you have anything to add to that?
Through the chair, explain that well. Really what the codes of practice does is kind of a crossover administration. So on the sanitary sewer side of things, those properties are known for potentially hazardous materials on site. From the stormwater side of things, they take that inventory of properties and they begin to assign a special charge on the stormwater side, recognizing the risk and the real evidence that might come from runoff itself. So they use the inventory from sanitary sewer to create a list of properties and special charges on the stormwater side. And then that's where you get into some of those examples of rebates, or where there are on-site special facilities that are actually reducing that risk of water quality, whether it be an oil and grit separator or other types of treatment on-site, to go about modifying that charge back to them. So this is where you start to begin to cross over between and use the best information that you have available. It's not that common for there to be any works of the utility to support private facilities. However, it is common in utilities in North America that there could be special grants or special rebates available for extraordinary types of upgrades to some of those risky properties. So there can be amounts that have put off to the side, but those property owners can access those to do special improvements on site. Thank you.
And one more, if I may. I quite like the Victoria model, because if memory serves me correct, if say a residential lot was at a certain percentage of their taxes going to the storm water, and they were able to mitigate the amount of water going into the storm system, they could lower their taxes. I would see that as much more of an incentive to get people, to stop putting water into the stormwater system, which then puts less pressure on the stormwater system. It'll last longer, and all these other sort of things. So if we are going down this route, I would certainly like to see that part of it somewhere in there. Thank you.
Certainly the incentive side of things really needs to be a part of the bylaw and the policy, because without that, as Councillor Bonner, as you noted, that there's no reason for people to upgrade or to do anything to kind of mitigate the impact they're having. So the incentive piece has to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bonner. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think just speaking to that incentive piece, I think this is a very important program and road to go down. And it's a critical set of asset, and it's something that I think if it's diluted into property taxes, it doesn't get the attention that it needs. I think the question is just sort of like where on the scale, like compared, Campbell River to Victoria. My understanding is that, by pulling it out as its own separate utility, and if cost is reflective of the type of development that goes in, the more impermeable surfaces and the less infrastructure to sort of help that groundwater, surface water infiltrate, the higher your costs are going to be. And so I think just, as we're investigating it, I don't want to make it so simple that we kind of lose that aspect of it. And I think, I don't know the degree that residential properties are contributing to the stress on the stormwater system, but making decisions of having certain areas paved or not, and that type of thing, is that level of acuity possible without having an enormous amount of administrative and effort to accomplish that?
Through the chair to Councillor Gesbrook. So certainly it's possible, and that's what Victoria has done. The challenge is it takes resources to do that. And I believe they hired, Mr. Lee can correct me if I'm wrong, but they hired several staff members just to maintain that information. They hired 2 or 3 staff members, and all they do is maintain that information.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible, but there's a trade-off there. And currently, our staff consensus is at the moment that it's probably worth it to do that for the ICI properties, the institutional and the commercial. That makes sense. For residential, probably the best way to approach it is a land use class, and you could scale it based on area too, but not get into the detail about how much area they have for parking or how big their roof is. Like, just don't get into that level of detail, and we could avoid this extra staff resource required to manage the system.
Right.
Still get most of the benefit out of the equity.
And just to follow up on that, I wonder, sort of the impacts on the stormwater system. A lot of it, I imagine, is determined at time of, say, subdivision, on how it's being laid out, and is all the measures that need to be taken to reduce the impact on the stormwater system and to make sure that it's well functioning done at the development permit stage anyhow, where as opposed to having this utility and sort of after the fact of people trying to keep their costs low by upgrading or that.
Through the chair, Councillor Wesselbrock. So current development requirements are that they manage their runoff outflow volumes to pre-development conditions. So that's the current bylaw, that's the engineering standard right now. A lot of developments have occurred over previous decades that didn't have that requirement. So there's plenty of commercial and industrial properties in town that don't have any of that detention tank or facility or what have you. So those sort of legacy developments probably contribute an awful lot more than the modern ones do. So current developments today, they have runoff controls that certainly reduce their runoff.
Right, so a stormwater utility, it's not going to drive better policy and permitting processes for newer developments. That's not really its purpose.
What it might do is it might drive some incentives for some of those older properties to upgrade their system or change their system so they don't have those high runoff flows.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. There are no other questions from council. I'll just express my appreciation. I like knowing that this conversation is coming. It seems important, and it has the potential to be a big one for the community, so appreciate the foreknowledge here. Our next item on the agenda is bus stop shelter and bench strategy. Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to briefly follow up with on Councillor Armstrong's question around the downtown survey that was being filled out. So that was a setting in the survey to avoid, just to lower barriers, I think, for the community. So it was sort of unregistered, so we didn't want to have people label themselves as they were filling the survey. So that's the reason it was done that way. Thank you, Chair. So this discussion's been in front of council before. I think where we're at is that we've got about a 6-month window before our current contract expires with regard to the budget or the benches and the bus shelters. And so this is the time to start to prepare for that. I think we've certainly seen some concerns. The bus shelters are put in places where it suits the advertiser, not necessarily where it suits the transit user. And that's, part of its age, it's showing its age. I think going forward, we would want to make sure that if we followed a similar pattern in the future, that we'd want to make sure that we're suiting the transit user as well. So I've asked Mr. Rose to go over the options with you, or just introduce the subject, and really the intent is to have this open for discussion. You can see a staff recommendation there that it essentially revisits the contract, and there's a number of reasons for that Mr. Rose can get into.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sims. This is a fairly brief but impactful report for council today. We've got a fairly lengthy history of using third-party shelters in our system, and we've had an ongoing rollover of contracts. Unfortunately, most of those contracts have been fairly short and have left us with assets that are upwards of 30 years old. As Mr. Sims indicated, we've also got a fairly limited ability under the current contract to locate shelters where we need them to best support our transit users. We also don't have quite as much depth of service in the contract that we'd like to see for the operation and maintenance of the shelters right now. And so over the past few years, we've gone through and we've reviewed with other municipalities as to how they approach it, and discussed with other agencies about what different programs could look like. And so we've put forward three options, two sort of with a third one for maybe further discussion. The first and recommended is that we do reissue a contract or an RFP to seek a proponent who can provide us with the services that we want, still generate revenue from the program, and enable us to prioritize where the amenities go. The second option is fairly status quo. It is to work within the processes and guidance of our procurement policy. There are some drawbacks of that approach. We would likely continue to see much more of the same structures, same locations, probably not a great deal of change in the service. And I do want to preface that it's not so much to say it's a shortcoming of the contractors that are in place right now with respect to the service. It's more to the terms of the contract and the expectations that we've laid out. The third option is one that we have considered, and that is to work with the RDN and BC Transit to procure our own shelters. However, we have found that is significantly expensive and likely will not put us in a place where we do have a cash positive program. And so, as I said, the recommended approach right now is a long-term contract or a long-term RFP, but we are here to discuss that. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. We have a question from Councillor Armstrong.
Oh, thank you. When I was looking at the report, 39 shelters generate $26,000. 300 benches only generate $48,000. So why aren't we looking at putting in more shelters than benches? Because obviously we would generate a lot more money, which would offset the costs.
Through the chair, I think it's important to have a complete system that includes both amenities. If we are looking at, from a user's perspective, if they're waiting for their bus on a cold winter night when it's rainy and windy, a bench is not as helpful and doesn't create the user experience that we're striving for to get more and more people opting to use transit.
Well, that's my point. Why wouldn't, instead of doing the 300 benches, why wouldn't we change those to shelters?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. We could, but I do still think that some combination of amenities would be necessary.
Well, I'm just looking because it obviously, it's a huge generator, the shelters versus the benches. Yeah, it's huge. Like, I mean, 39 shelters is 26,000. So if you put that in 300 benches generates 40,000, which means the shelters are doing 10 times better than, almost 10 times better, not quite, probably 8.5, better than the benches.
I would agree. There is, if we're looking to add more shelters, though, there is a significant cost. So if we can achieve a contract structure that will enable us to add more shelters and continue to generate more revenue, then we would certainly.
Thank you.
Mayor Krog?
Thank you very much. I mean, this topic has come up before, and I don't pretend to be a transit user, as some members of council are and regular users, but it strikes me, and I raise the same issue again, and maybe we have to consider biting the bullet as this deadline approaches us, and that is that surely if I enter a city that has transit services, my expectation is I'll be able to readily recognize what they are, as opposed, if it's a public service, as opposed to a multitude of private services. You know, you hop out of a jet plane in Cancun, are there public buses or are there private buses? I mean, the recognition factor to me in terms of encouraging transit use for people who visit, but let alone making it, how shall I say, more appealing or attractive to local users or potential users is likewise important. And as Councillor Armstrong's raised the issue around, you know, benches versus covers, I mean, I think we're going to expect more extreme weather events, and this is the rainy, wet coast to start with, and it's not going to get any better in the near future. And if they're long, hot summers, it would be kind of nice to have some shade for people as well. So I just throw this out, and I realize, you know, we have just gone through a budgetary process that's resulted in a number that's bigger than many of us thought. But working in conjunction with the regional district, it may be time for us to try and get some uniformity to this as a necessary part of encouraging the transit use that most of us, I think, believe is crucial to reducing our overall carbon footprint. So pardon me, it's not really much of a question, Chair, but I think it's a consideration that's certainly in the back of my mind as we look at this topic generally.
Thank you. In order, I have Councillor Martman, Councillor Bonner, Councillor Brown, Councillor Turley, and Councillor Geselbrock. So, Councillor Martman.
Thank you. Through you, I'm just wondering, under the request proposal for a 25-year term, one of the drawbacks is it doesn't align with the corporate procurement policy. Wouldn't part of it be able to align with the corporate policy, or why doesn't it?
Through the chair, the vast majority of it would, but the procurement policy is limited at 5 years. So that's the one condition that wouldn't align. Everything else would. So.
But there may be other components of it that might be under the sustainable.
Oh yeah, all of the other aspects of the procurement would be fulfilled.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. I am opposed to option one. I don't even know if I would, I'm going to say this nicely. I have an issue with a company that is willing to commit to a 25-year contract, not the city, I can see that. And having been one of those people that do use the buses on a regular basis, our existing system of how we raise money through advertising on buses has created bus stops and bus shelters that are anything but shelters. My probably best example is the one outside of Northfield and Bowen heading north. That one was a bus shelter designed specifically for cars so that they can see the advertising because of the way it's laid out, and it provides no shelter whatsoever for people using it. And this is because the company that we've agreed to put it in has no interest in keeping bus riders dry either. They're interested in advertising. And I think we're possibly looking at this the wrong way around. So before I go into my idea, which people may or not want to listen to, is I do have some questions regarding the costs, and this has come up before. On alternate 3, we mentioned the replacement or placement of 40 shelters and 300 benches at a cost of $2 million. And so when this came up before Council, I did a fair amount of research on this, and even if we go at the idea that a bus shelter costs $20,000, which I don't think it does, that puts benches at around the $4,000 mark. And I would say, if you give me $2 million to put those things on the ground, I would gladly take that, because I'll probably end up with $1 million in my pocket, because I do not believe that 40 bus shelters and 300 benches cost $2 million. So I'd like to know how that breaks out, because I have talked to the suppliers and they say, well, bus shelters don't cost that much. Now I realize that we have to install them, right? And there's a cost to that. But even then, it still doesn't equate to those kind of numbers. The other question is if we went this route of number 3, where we create our own inventory of bus shelters and benches, are we able to get funding through BC Transit for the 44% or so that they cover on these sort of things, which would mean we could install twice as many of those things for what's quoted at $2 million?
So through the chair, unfortunately, I do have to share that the purchase and installation of a bus shelter is close to $50,000, based on our experiences and our work with the contractors. There is an option to pursue complementary grants, either through BC Transit or with the RDN Transit. Unfortunately, that program is typically limited to about 4 or 5 shelters per year. So that would put us at about an 8-year renewal cycle. One of the noteworthy drawbacks of that is that we will be forfeiting the revenue stream moving forward. We have not been able to have a contractor come in and operate our city-owned infrastructure as a advertising platform so far. So yes, it is a significant capital cost. It so far does not appear that it would generate revenue in the future. And at the end of the asset's life cycle, we then need to renew it for whatever the 2040 price tag would be. So.
Okay. I much rather trust the city and the city engineers and the RDN folks as well to figure out where bus stops need to go, less so a company that's mostly interested in the advertising value of them. So here's my idea. When I called Daytech earlier this morning, you can get a 4x8 bus shelter delivered for around $700 or $750 if you want a bench in it, $7,500. And I cannot believe in my mind that creating a pad to hold it would cost another $40,000. So what I'm trying to say is maybe we look at this a different way. Instead of trying to find an advertiser who will build us bus shelters where they want to build them, why don't we build an inventory of bus shelters and benches? And then the city doesn't worry about the advertising. They just say, we have this inventory. It produces this much space to put advertising. What advertising companies want to use it? And then they just pay us a straight fee for the use of the bus shelters. And then we don't have to worry about figuring out buying people who want to advertise on them, all that sort of stuff. We just rent them out, right? But the thing is, we should also look at, in terms of our social procurement, I am absolutely sure we can find local companies, right, who would be willing to do this work and even build the bus shelters from scratch, because we have manufacturers, at a much less cost than $50,000 per bus shelter. I cannot believe the one at corner of Northfield and Bowen cost $50,000 to put in. I just can't for the life of me. And so I just think number 3 would be better. I much more value the assets that we would have, even though we are going to be replacing them. I expect if the province comes up with the 44% coverage, and we can apply for that through the BC Transit, that we would be able to have a much, much larger inventory of bus shelters and benches around the city that we can actually use. Thank you. My rant.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to staff, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm having a little bit of technology problems, but through you to staff, has BC Transit or the RDN seen this report, and did they have comment?
Through the chair, I have had discussions with the RDN through the preparation of this report, and they have not sort of endorsed or any of the options. They've indicated that at this point in time that they are not able to participate or engage in anything more than our annual sort of shelter purchase or install program, and indicated that that would likely not change in the near future.
Okay, well, I'll just provide my comments. I think people have more or less covered them, but I'm definitely not in support of continuing on with private model, with the even with a longer term. I really appreciated the comments of His Worship and Councillor Bonner there. I think if you do want to take transit seriously, and you have to look at everything comprehensively, from the pedestrian connectivity, cycling connectivity, the shelters, and the land use, and the buses. It all has to come together. So I'm really not worried about generating small ad revenue. What I am, I'd rather see higher user fee revenue. I am more or less supportive of some sort of alternate direction here to seek out something that puts transit and transit users first, not advertisements or very small advertising revenue. So I think something fundamentally needs to change in the paradigm. I don't know what it is, but I think I would be in favor of signing an MOU with or proposing an MOU with BCT and RDN about what would a comprehensive replacement strategy look like over a given period of time, and what would the cost sharing formula look like to see these shelters replaced and the shelter program enhanced and expanded in Nanaimo. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So I have a question to staff, and then depending on the answer, I have a comment. The question I have is, who pays for the cleaning and maintenance of the bus shelters?
Through the chair, the current third-party shelters and benches are dealt with by their service provider, and so that's completely hands-off from the city.
Okay, thank you. The other comment then would be that I have a bit of a concern because, yes, I know I don't use the buses very often, but I do drive by many of the shelters, and quite often there are homeless people encamped in them, and I can't believe that when they leave they clean up after themselves. So my concern with Councillor Bonner's suggestion, albeit it sounds okay, I think there's going to be extra costs involved with the city doing it on its own, and cleaning would be the #1 priority in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, in the 25-year contract that you'd be looking at, what additional stipulations would you consider be putting in outside of just preferred locations and that?
Through the chair, I think that we'd have to work out drafting the contract or the RFP, but I would like to see more direct control from the city on locations. I'd like to see an expanded level of service, not just cleaning and maintenance, but to overall seasonal upkeep, addressing things that come up from that. I'd also like to expand the service requirements to include sanitation. I'd also like to expand it to include some end-of-trip facilities for cycling. So those are sort of off the cuff, those are the first things. But if there's, depending on where this conversation goes, we're certainly open to additional items.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think starting from the point of identifying what is the bus shelter system that we want, and that will take, you know, a considerable amount of effort and time designing that and coming up with all those things that you mentioned that will make sense for our system now and how we want to develop it, keeping pace with what the usage wants. And then it's figuring out what's the best way to accomplish that at the best cost. And it sounds like the one option is having a 25-year contract and having it, you know, provided by a private carrier. But I think ultimately we do lose a certain amount of control over that, and it would have to be a pretty well detailed RFP for a 25-year contract, and there's a lot of variables in that 25 years that we might not be able to manage. And I'm just curious, like, you know, I think it'll ultimately will come to council, you know, how much money are we willing to invest in something like that? At the end of the day, that's the question. And the option that Councillor Bonner put out, like, can we build this system? And then I know that we're having discussions around sponsorship, having that in mind, and then be able to lease out the built system for sponsorship, and then be able to manage that revenue to pay for the system a little bit. Just off the cuff, to me, thinking of that through would take a lot more in-house staff resources and time and to manage it all. But there's a greater level of control. And so is that feasible to go down that route?
Madam Chair, it's a very good question, and staff had the same question for the consultant working on the sponsorship program. And simply put, when it comes to shelters, there's not enough revenue to have staff manage the program. So if this was a staff or a city-owned asset, it would take more staff time and energy to sell advertising on the staff or the city-owned asset than it would generate in revenue. The fundamental around option one is it's you know, and reading the room, it's not your preferred option, and but it keeps things simple as far as the ownership of shelters. It keeps it sort of apart from staff taking on, or the city taking on another asset class to look after, maintain, and upkeep, and respond to complaints, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the challenges, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Good. Yeah, I think just for me, I think when we're worried about another thing to take care of, and that we put it into the hands sort of private management, the primary purpose there is, you know, the profit from it, and I think that what I've seen, I mean, I haven't really seen anybody excited about our bus shelters in town, and that is meeting the need. And I think that we could be setting us up for more of the same if we go that route, even with our best efforts in setting that up. And so I think I'd be more favorable to a bit more explanation in an alternative route with very clear understanding that it is going to require a lot more effort on our end, and that's going to come at a price.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I have a few points here. One of my questions is going to be directed to staff, where we heard Councillor Bonner said he talked to somebody that could do it for much less dollars. Can you clarify that? And on that, is that because maybe he's just putting something up that doesn't maintain city regulations that have to be done, or transit regulations? Because it does seem there's a huge variance.
Through the chair, I can only speak to what the information is that I've received from suppliers, and it's, you know, it's rack rate, like it's, you know, $30,000 for a shelter, plus the installation, plus the transport, plus the preparation for the site. If we, depending on whether we choose to hardwire electrical or go with solar, if we want any sort of wayfinding or anything of that nature, it continues to roll up. And all I can speak to is the folks that I've spoken with.
Thank you. I myself am in favor of option one for the fact when Mr. Rose spoke about the fact that he would put a lot of that stuff into the RFP, such as maintenance and all of that, which I think, and city having site-specific locations is really important. We already know that our bus system is heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. I mean, and when I heard Councillor Brown say go to a user rate, they could never afford how much it would cost. So we would take away, I see the bus service as a social service, which really helps those that don't have a lot of cash, and I see it staying that way for a long time, and I'm fine with helping support that. But I think we have to look at what's best for the city and the taxpayer, and I believe option one gives that, especially with the comments Mr. Rose put where they would be including all that in the RFP. I think if we went to option three, we're going to have to hire, I would say, probably 2 or 3 more staff, which is going to bring us probably close to $200,000 to $300,000 in staff wages and benefits, which is an ongoing expense, which I don't think is fair to the taxpayer. When we can look at number one, and when we talk about the fact that, well, number one's private's going to make money off of it, well, we're trying to do the same thing on number three, so it doesn't really matter to me either way. But I think option one for me is the most realistic and the best for our citizens of Nanaimo. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of subsidization, the most subsidized thing I think in our entire budget is the roads and on-street parking that we generate and put millions of dollars into each year. I don't have a problem with that. So I do have a question though. Last time we talked about this, we were asking to delay things for a while to come up with another plan. Is this the other plan that is coming up out of that delay?
Through your worship, effectively, yes. This is after going back and discussing with other municipalities how their approach is. This is sort of a presentation of what we found and what staff feel strikes the best balance between structuring a contract that provides the service that the community needs with an economic balance to potentially generate some revenue while minimizing costs to the community. And so, a long duration contract is not the most ideal circumstance. Not having direct control over the amenities is not ideal. But when considering all of the implications and the costs associated with retaining that control and having to manage those additional elements, it was deemed that this is the best option at the time.
Okay, and going back to reason why I don't like option one is it's way too long, and also I cannot for the life of me believe that a corporation whose primary goal is profit, and in this case would be through advertising, would want to start putting bus shelters where we actually need them. And that's not on the main thoroughfares, it's on these secondary thoroughfares, secondary streets, residential streets where we are building larger apartment buildings, and we're having a lot of seniors coming to this area who will probably someday not be using cars. And so for that reason, number one, it locks us in for way too long. I would be at the very least okay with number two. And that just gives us an opportunity to come up with a much better plan, because I only believe that if the city needs to own the asset and be responsible for the asset, to have an asset that is actually reflective of the needs of the citizens in Nanaimo. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bonner. I have Councillor Thorpe, Councillor Geselbrecht, and Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, just a couple of thoughts and a question. This is I appreciate the pros and cons that staff have provided us, and it's a difficult one for me to come to a definite decision on today, but if needs be, I will. I think as Councillor Armstrong pointed out, option number 3 definitely will shift more onus onto Nanaimo taxpayers if we were to go down that road. And I connect that to Councillor Brown's earlier reference to user pay, and that's something that we've already mentioned this afternoon. And you know, user pay is a great idea, but would the RDN Transit Select Committee be prepared to promote increasing transit fares to a user pay model to cover the extra costs? I doubt it, so that's a concern. I'm not automatically opposed to option 1. I frankly think that if staff could negotiate in the dealings with the service provider the things that we want to see in a contract, then that would be advantageous. And quite frankly, I'm surprised that a company would be willing to commit to a 25-year contract. But I guess that's their business. I don't have as low an opinion of our contract provider as Councillor Bonner does. And I think if we can get what we want from a negotiated agreement, then I would support it. Otherwise, I would probably lean to option 2, to a shorter time frame, just to give us more time to sort this whole issue out and all its ramifications. My question to staff relates to the length of the contract. And I recognize that we are in open here, and so I'm going to keep it very general. But I'm curious about the degree of competition to provide this type of service. Could I get a very general comment on that from staff?
Through the chair, there are multiple contractors that could fulfill this service. So in order to we would need to ensure that it's an open and balanced public process. So I think I probably should just leave it at that.
Madam Chair, I think one of the challenges that we've uncovered with option 2, the short duration would likely not attract much attention in the marketplace. I think that's the concern. The length of this is directly tied to the return on the investment that the contractors would have to make, or the bus shelter providers would have to make, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So then is it fair to say that the longer term contract is more appealing to the providers that might bid on it, and would also give us a more competitive response to our proposal?
Through the chair, yes, that's fair to say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Geselbrock.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'm just curious, like places like Victoria or Kelowna, Prince George, what are they kind of on the similar model of the
I can't speak to, sorry, through the chair, I can't speak to Prince George. Victoria is in a similar model, and they're currently in a 20-year contract.
Okay. Do you know of any municipalities that are managing their own
Kelowna does have a number of shelters that are under their own operation. And if I remember correctly, they are focused more at exchanges and sort of transfer points, but they do also augment it with third party.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of just points of clarification. I referred to user fees, and and that what I meant by that was your transit fare. Obviously, there's already a user pay component of transit. So what I was suggesting is not that I always think fares should be reviewed, but what I was suggesting here is that a good focus of efforts here would not be necessarily advertising dollars to increase revenue into the transit system, but rather increased ridership to that results in more revenue into the rider system. So I think that's an important framing when we're talking about what we're actually trying to achieve in the system. It's not trying to get it's trying to get a system that's viable, and whether you have advertising dollars, it's really not. It's kind of pointless in that calculation there. All advertising, tens of thousands of dollars compared to millions of dollars in user fares. Well, the focus should be user fares. I really think we're falling ourselves into a bit of like binary thinking here in terms of our options. I think there's a real discussion that could happen with BC Transit and the RDN about creating a true plan. It may come back to a model here that does seem some private shelters, but time and time again, I've heard from BC Transit, I've heard from RDN staff that if we look at what a long-term, or if we look at a longer-term plan with a high level of ambitiousness and seriousness, BC Transit will always show up at the table to be part of that discussion. And so when we're, right now they have an existing shelter program, but that is independent of any discussions or maybe some agreements that can be brokered with them. So, I see that we're running out of time here, but there really, I think, is a missed opportunity to have that conversation. So, I'm not comfortable, definitely not comfortable with a 25-year term, because what you will see in that type of system is initial investment and then diminishing investment because the contract is already secured. So, when it comes to these type of public assets, I don't think it makes sense, especially on a 25-year term. I understand here around making it competitive, but I don't think it will actually solve the issue other than for a few years at the beginning of the term. So, I would implore council to really take a breather here and ask for conversation between the transit provider, which is the RDN, and the major transit authority that we deal with, which is BC Transit, to have a conversation about what a long-term plan might look like and what would the funding breakdown be. That conversation may lead right back to this place, but until I have that conversation, I don't think it's, in a very serious way, I don't think it's responsible to proceed with this type of decision. So, I would be trying to craft a motion on the fly here, but Chair, I would like to move that the City of Nanaimo engage with BC Transit and the Regional District of Nanaimo on the topic of developing a long-term transit shelter deployment plan.
Thank you. That's seconded by Councillor Bonner. I have a list of speakers, but can we keep this to the actual? Okay. Councillor Martman, I have you before. Do you want to speak to the motion on the floor, or were your comments more general? Yep, I have you next.
Thank you. Okay. I wouldn't be speaking to the motion on the floor. I had a question on previous.
Okay. So we will come back to you then. Councillor Armstrong.
To the motion on the floor, this question directed to staff. I see that the contract expires by June 22nd. So what is the absolute latest we need to come back with the decision? Because I would like to have that time frame put into Councillor Brown's motion so that we can act without being stuck. But if Councillor Brown's amenable to that, to put a time frame in.
Through the chair, we were aspiring to have the RFP out on the market very early in the new year. So
could we say that this meeting must take place, or meetings, whatever, and come back to you, but would at the end of January be too late?
It's getting close, but I think if we can conclude this conversation by the end of January, we can probably...
So if Councillor Brown would be amenable, I'd like to put a time limit in that those discussions must be taken place, and then the report comes back to to either the GPC or council by January 30th, 2022 for decisions.
I'm okay with that amendment.
Okay, we're good. Okay. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you. I'm in favor of this motion. I think regardless, there's definitely some work that needs to be done in sort of getting a clear understanding of the shelter system that we want, and that's going to either inform an RFP in the future or, the future steps that we would take sort of more in-house. But I think that this is a necessary first step. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. To the motion on the floor, I'm probably willing to support it, but just to clarify, if I may, through you to staff, I believe I heard that conversation has already taken place between city staff, the RDN staff, and their conversation or opinion about BC Transit's commitment. So could you just tell me if I imagined that or clarify?
Through the chair, I have had several conversations over the last 18 to 24 months, most recently probably 6 weeks ago. And right now the process to engage in a cost share grant application with BC Transit and RDN is a lengthy process. It's upwards of a year. And right now, the only option we have is to partner on the annual program, which is the one I referred to, which is a 53% cost share with typically 4 shelters available to us. That's the conversations that's taken place to date.
Okay, thank you. So on the basis of that information, I don't believe I can support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like, Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a little bit further on that. As many of you know, transit is near and dear to me. I have had formerly when I was chair of the Transit Select and more recently with RDN staff, that this conversation is always welcome, the level of seriousness, and it would be very much appreciated to be part of this discussion. And I confirm that prior to this meeting as well. So just don't know if that changes anyone's mind, but the conversation is open by the transit service provider to have this conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in with a question before Councillor Bonner, and that is, what happens if the contract lapses?
Through the chair, it's somewhat unknown. The contractual obligation terminates, and so the revenue stream will, I would assume, terminate on the completion of the date of the contract. The big question is what happens with the existing hardware that's out there. It could be removed very quickly.
And the possibilities of an extension on that contract, have those been explored?
So we've extended the contract as far as we possibly can, and so it's important to understand that this is actually 2 contracts we're dealing with right now. It's both the bench and the shelter.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bonner.
Thank you. That was actually my question is, I think our first meeting on this was the request to delay the contract or allow it to renew 1 more year. I would hope we would possibly look at doing that. I mean, we're not asking them to replace bus shelters. We're just asking them to carry on for 1 more year and just not rip them up.
Through the chair, that would essentially be the option 2, issue an RFP for up to 5 years. So whether it's 3 years plus extensions, it would fit within those parameters. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And option 2, if I may, includes combining both bench and shelter services under 1 contract, correct?
That would be the intent, yep. But that is open for discussion as well if there's a desire to go a different direction.
Okay. Councillor Armstrong?
Yes, sorry. I don't know if you've answered this before or not, I can't remember, but so the contractor or the contractors put in those bus shelters and the benches. Do they have the right of removal? Or is it in the contract that it stays after their contract has been finished, or can they take it with them?
Through the chair, no, that it is their asset, their infrastructure. So as soon as the contract's terminated, then they can remove it at any time.
So that says basically that just about every bus shelter and every bus stop in the city can be removed. So that's a huge concern. I think we need to really look at that seriously, because I think that's something that needs to be addressed also in the RFP, because it kind of leaves us at the mercy of the contractor if we don't get something in place sooner. So I'm really mixed on this. I don't know which way to go. I still believe number one's the best option, but I understand Councillor Brown's concerns, and if it's not going to jeopardize the process, as I've heard from staff, if so long as we're back with the decision by January 30th. And I see Mr. Rose is kind of like up in the air on that, but I think it's really important that we do get more input from the RDN, and I imagine it may even go to the RDN's Transit Select Committee for input as well. So I think that's something that hasn't been done. So I'm inclined to support Councillor Brown's motion for those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong. You're the last person on the speakers list. So before we vote, I'll share that I'll also be supporting Councillor Brown's motion with the intention that we would have a decision by January, and recognizing that that puts us in a slightly risky position. But that's, I believe, bringing in more people to this conversation, which is obviously complicated, is a good thing. So all those in favor? And opposed? Councillor Thorpe and Councillor Turley. Thank you, that passes. Thank you, staff. And now on to the Reimagine Nanaimo update.
10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to turn it over here momentarily to Ms. Bhopal Singh to go over the next item on your agenda, which is our Phase 2 Public Engagement Summary, as you see here on the title screen. Ms. Bhopal Singh is going to touch briefly on kind of who we've talked to over this last phase. I think we've talked to you before about that, but really today is focusing on the key learnings and what we've heard through this Phase 2 and summary. So it's just key learnings and feedback around the goals, the indicators, and the 3 scenarios that you'll recall that we went out to the community with. And then also just end the day on just kind of the next steps as we head through the month of December, and hopeful to have our Phase 3 launch in January. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Bhopal Singh.
Good afternoon, Council. So I'm going to try and whip you through an efficient 10-minute update on the Phase 2 process. So some of the slides you've got, I'm not going to focus on them too much. I'm going to skip to the key learnings. So just bear with me. So you all know why we were doing Phase 2 is to drill down, get more detailed feedback on the different land use scenarios based on the input we'd received in Phase 1 and other research. And as you can see, we're drilling down to greater levels of detail in terms of the orange section, starting to develop the hybrid plan. So one thing that we did get was good feedback. And again, I'll remind us that we're all doing this integrated planning process, which is like an official community plan on major rocket fuel. And with the engagement, it's without further ado, this is just our team have been really, I think, to use a PRC analogy, knocking it out of the park. Phase 2 required many members of the community to give up 1 hour to 2 hours of their time to give more in-depth feedback compared to the more higher level feedback that we received in Phase 1. So we were very pleased with the level of dedication, people taking time to do workshops and give really detailed feedback online. So in total, we got over 2,000 detailed surveys. And again, given the amount of time that it took people to give that feedback, it's very impressive for the City of Nanaimo to do that. And on top of that, we also had more detailed workshops as well. So in terms of demographics, as we anticipated, we did have lower than the statistical population for the under 24 age group. But what we did do is we had the elementary school students do something like 900 and over 900 participation through art. And we also had 84 students under the age of 19 participate in detailed workshops, and as well 50 VIU students. So in terms of demographic participation...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Previous slide, Did we go back looking for youth input because we didn't get enough? And that's what, so, okay.
Yes, and we anticipated it. We anticipated that the online survey form would generate less participation than us going directly to where students were.
Right.
So we anticipated that based on our experience with phase one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so again, other than the Northtown area, we got pretty good representation demographically across our different geographies and neighborhoods. And then a diversity of feedback opportunities, many of which you also assisted us with, not least of which was a TikTok video that was extremely popular. And so here's again the summary of the foundations form, which was basically our confirmation of the goals and if we're on the right track, the scenarios, the 3 land use scenarios, and then virtual scenarios workshops. So again, skipping forward, focusing on the key learning. So what the foundations survey showed us, it confirmed to us that we are on the right track. 3/4 of those roughly who participated agreed that the directions of the different goals met their expectations for Nanaimo. And whether we call it the donut or the sustainability foundations, these are things that we are quite pleased to get that affirmation. We did get some good tips though about tweaking those goals and the language and explanation, but overall having 3/4 of those who responded affirm that was reassuring. So what we saw was the Green Nanaimo had the most support with 82%, and then the Enabled Nanaimo 73%. So on average, you can see pretty high support for the direction that the goals are outlining. We also asked people about the indicators and whether they felt the draft indicators were appropriate for reaching our different goals. And again, 7 out of 10 who responded felt that the draft indicators were going to be effective to help us monitor progress. And as we said to council, we were doing the indicators up front in the process instead of at the end. And the indicators and targets are something that will be tweaked annually as we get more data and more opportunities to collect indicators that are more meaningful. So the indicators are not set in stone. They are things to be evaluated regularly. So in terms of the scenarios and the priorities for planning...
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. Will council see tweaked indicators as a result of phase 2 engagement?
Yes, and they may not be major tweaks, but they'll be what we can do with the information we have at this time. And so you will be getting that as part of phase 3.
Great, and can I just confirm that political voice will be in there?
Yes.
And do we have any indicators on that?
Well, we were going to look at voter participation for that one. And, you know, that's a tricky one when you're looking at things we don't influence like federal and provincial, but it is a measure. And then certainly we have our municipal participation rates, albeit every 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Mr. Lindsay.
Can I just add into that too? Because I think that's an important discussion that I think started as this project evolved, and we recognize there needs to be some further discussion around that. So I've talked to Ms. Gurry, and between our teams where, yes, voter participation is in all likelihood a very reasonable measure, but we're doing some work looking at what other communities are doing, see if there's some best practices on indicators and bring that specifically back for a separate discussion. We're not sure at this point that'll be ready to be done before the launch of phase 3, but it's certainly something we'd want to have done before the final adoption of the plan.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm glad to hear it's still being wrestled with. It's a really tricky one to put indicators on, but I'm glad we're still looking at it.
It is, and one thing I will add is the Get Involved platform is also another way of measuring the levels of participation on individual planning processes and just more generally how many people are staying aware of city processes through that mechanism.
Thank you.
Okay, so some key learnings. Participants' priorities for growth. You've got more details in the attachment, but the top 4 were protecting open space, walking, bike, and transit-supported neighborhoods, housing affordability, and living in close proximity to parks. And here's again that rank with the top 4. I think I said it in slightly the wrong order. The second one being a housing affordability. And so you can see that these priorities will help us and help us guide you as we look at different trade-offs in terms of meeting our different goals. So this is a really key part of what we were asking people to do. The 3 different land use scenarios, the first being the current path. If we were to continue on with our current OCP, mobility hubs based on 7 town centers similar to our 2014 transportation master plan. And then it's the central focus, which is scenario 3, looking at a core VIU, the downtown, and the hospital area. And so what we see here is we asked our community, please rank out of 5 how well you think each of these land use scenarios will help move us towards our goal and what you'd like to see for the future. And you can see that between 2 and 3, there is a fairly close alignment. And so one of the things as we saw this is then to determine what was it about 2 and 3 that people really liked. And so one of the things you should note, and maybe you also heard, is that some people said, you know what, we're thinking about, would you consider a hybrid between 2 and 3? So some of the things people liked about number 2 was it supports change in all parts of the city. It works with Nanaimo's linear nature. It could support more mixed use at mall sites. It supports higher industrial lands and jobs. And then with 3, it was seen as the most progressive of the scenarios. It would support greater downtown revitalization, would be the most efficient use of land and servicing costs, and it aligns better with climate goals. So there's more details in the report about the challenges that people saw as well as the negatives, but that's the highlights there. And then our task now is, as we speak, work continues to come up with a hybrid based on this feedback. So common themes on all the scenarios, directions participants favored, opportunities to densify and increase downtown, having the services closer to residents, and building on what we have. And then directions that the participants typically favored less was patterns that would lead to more outward growth, separated employment areas that would require more car travel, directions that could spread resources too thin, a little everywhere without achieving critical densities, for example. So for the community, the full engagement summary is attached to this report, but it's also online at our Get Involved site. And then in terms of next steps, so work is continuing on. We're here before you today. Our next key meeting is the Environment Committee on December 1st. And we would like to encourage Council to participate in that. That would really help us for you to be part of that meeting and observe the discussion going on, which will really focus on climate mitigation and GHGs, and looking at what different policies the committee might endorse Council supporting. And then over the coming weeks, we will go on with ongoing committee work with the idea that then we actually give Council a chance to look at the different hybrid options, and then in January coming back with a concrete plan of what we go out with phase 3 to ask the community to give feedback on in terms of a hybrid option and key policy changes that are different from what we currently have. So we are aiming for launching in January once you give us the go-ahead with the materials in January. And so that's the timeline we are on. And so you can see another draft of it here. And then we're aiming for final revisions and partner referrals in March. And you should know that we have been meeting with many of our stakeholders who are the official referrals far earlier in the process. So the first time they look at drafts and give input, they've had many opportunities prior to that. And we are hoping to still be on track with public hearing and plan adoption in April, all being well. And so that's another way of seeing it. And then that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Bopal-Singh. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you very much, Chair, and through you, thank you, Ms. Bopal-Singh, for speeding through that in a timely manner, and also for your ongoing hard work on this project. And this is not a question, so I apologize to my fellow councillors, but I have to make this comment, or I feel I'd like to. And one of your slides about 5 back, and you don't need to find it, but it was the key learning scenarios. Where participants were asked to identify their top 5 priorities. And I just found it really interesting that protecting open space was at the top of the list, having affordable housing, having neighborhoods where we can walk and bike and have available transit and so on. Those were all at the top of the list. And then down third from the bottom of the list was apparently low priority that the city has financial resilience. And I find that interesting, if not amusing. And it reminds me of our budget discussions where people want increased service levels, but they're not always that keen on having to pay for them. So if we do not, I would argue, have a financially resilient city with our affairs in order, then I don't see how we can effectively do those good things like protecting open spaces and having affordable housing and so on. So again, not a question, just a little comment, and it is what it is. That's what people thought was important, but I find it very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thorpe. Councillor Geselbrock.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if affordable housing and protected open spaces is financial resiliency. It's a question to ponder, but my question is just on scenario 2 and 3 hybrid seem to be a favorite for people, and I was just curious, like the Sandstone development that was presented to council, what scenario would that be a hybrid of those 3 scenarios, sort of in its current form?
Right. I think, as you're aware, Sandstone is, for the members of the public who are perhaps viewing for this for the first time, is an ongoing OCP application. And so we will be coming back with phase 3 with showing that area currently without a designation until we get that direction from council. And so council would be guiding us in terms of the approval process. Now, in terms of which scenario it would lean towards, it would lean more towards scenario, let's see, 3, which shows it as currently, I guess, employment lands. And what the Sandstone proposal currently has is more aligned with that type of approach. Whereas scenario 2 shows those lands, not all of it. Now, all the neighborhood land is consistent with Sandstone. All 3 scenarios, all the neighborhood lands stay the same, but the key area of difference is what they call their neighborhood commercial center. And that area, what they're proposing from the current plan to now, would be more of a hybrid option of what I would say is scenario 3 with the addition of residential. So I think that would be my assessment of that. But the caveat being that our direction on that will be from the process. The applicant started this process before we started Reimagine, and as part of due process, we're continuing with that. And so we will be taking council's direction on that and incorporating that in the final land use plan. But when we go to phase 3, in all likelihood, we will be showing that as an area yet to be determined through the planning process. And I realize it's a tricky one. It's just how the stars aligned with their timing and ours, because they started their application before we launched this process. So that's the best I can answer right now.
Okay, so just clarity, like the proposal that is in the process right now would be more aligned with scenario 3 out of those 3 scenarios. Is that correct?
Yes, not completely, but it's the closest in terms of what they're looking at is a combination of commercial and then industrial in part, with the addition of a reduced amount of residential compared to their current OCP master plan. Right. I'm not sure if Mr. Lindsay has anything to add on that.
Madam Chair, I think the only thing I would add, and Ms. Wolpelsing said this, but I think it's important to reiterate is, I don't know the exact number, but I would say 3/4, 75% of the property, so that the neighborhood lands north of Cedar, the neighborhood lands in the extension area, and the existing industrial lands that are east of the existing landfill all stay the same from the existing plan and in all 3 scenarios. So the variation is in a small portion of the overall plan, and it's that area, what I would describe between the landfill and the highway. So, and I agree, it most closely aligns with 3, the scenario of employment lands and introducing more employment lands in in there, but I think there is an opportunity for, as we discussed, for sort of a hybrid between 2 and 3 that comes out in the next phase, and I suspect that's what we'll see.
Thanks.
That's all the questions for you, Ms. Bopalsing. Thank you for your presentation. Any questions in question period? Nope.
No, Chair, there's no questions on there.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong, seconded. Mayor Krog, all those in favor? Passes.
So, Chair, we'll just need about probably 10 minutes for staff to do the changeover from meeting types and switch the chair as well.
I'm going to stay.
Pardon me?